Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Amina Mahmood from the SingHealth Duke-NUS Global Health Institute. And on behalf of the Institute and the co-organizers, the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore and the Swee Hock School of Public Health, I'm delighted to welcome all of you. Thank you for sharing your time with us. This is the third webinar in our 4-webinar part series on the science and business of COVID-19. This webinar looks at how businesses and communities can remain resilient in the face of uncertainty and a host of unknowns. The moderator for today is Hsien-Hsien Lei, who is the CEO for the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, and with whom I've had the pleasure to co-organize this webinar series. I look forward to an interesting discussion. Hsien, over to you.
Thank you so much, Amina. Hi, I'm Hsien Lei. I'm welcoming you all today to the third webinar of our series on the science and business of COVID-19. And I always start with a public service announcement at the beginning of all the webinars that I lead, which is today is Monday, the 20th of April, and we are on day 21 of day 56 of the Singapore Circuit Breaker. So now that you have reset your clock and your calendar, this epidemiologist today is pleased to be playing armchair economist today, because as you know, many of our economists have been playing armchair epidemiologists lately. So it's quite a delight for me to be playing armchair economist today. Prof Hofman, who you'll hear from shortly, said earlier when we were getting ready that the real function of epidemiologists is to make economists look good. And so I hope that I will be able to make our panelists look good today. So let me introduce them. And before that, actually, I did a scan of today's headlines. And I'm sure all of you wake up and do the same thing as I do. And I wanted to see what the topics of conversation were for today. And some of the headlines I saw were CNA commentary, COVID-19 is reshaping what work looks like. We'll be talking about that today. Straits Times, COVID-19 strains India's overburdened healthcare system. We'll be talking about developing economies today. CNN, Singapore's migrant workers are suffering the brunt of the country's coronavirus outbreak. We'll be talking about inequality today. Wall Street Journal, coronavirus means the era of big government is back. Is it? And what role should they play? Another headline from Wall Street Journal, firms try fewer products, build inventory amid coronavirus. We'll be talking about business continuity planning as well. And then finally, something that is my pet peeve with this whole physical distancing thing. Bloomberg headline, Wall Street tries to figure out how to get back to the office. Inside Citigroup Inc.'s headquarters in Manhattan, executives are trying to solve a problem bedeviling much of Wall Street. How to get employees up elevators. My pet peeve, don't get in the elevator with me. Introducing our panelists today, Dr. Taimur Baig from DBS Bank. Taimur is a seasoned economist with close to 20 years experience covering the Asia region. His work experience in Singapore and Washington, D.C. spans central and commercial banks as well as the International Monetary Fund. His areas of specialty include international finance, macro risk spillover, exchange rate and fixed income analytics and forecasting, the economics of financial crisis, and demographics. Professor Bert Hofman, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Mr. Bert Hofman, a Dutch national, is the director of the East Asian Institute at NUS and professor of practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Before NUS, he was working with the World Bank, 22 years of which in Asia and 12 on China. Mr. Hofman was also the World Bank country director for China and the country economist and the chief economist for the World Bank in East Asia and the Pacific region. He also worked in Indonesia, the Philippines, Korea, and Mongolia. And then Mr. Gareth McElroy, Managing Director Singapore of Korn Ferry. Mr. McElroy's work with senior executives includes supporting leadership teams in leading mergers, acquisitions, and preparation for an IPO. Mr. McElroy has also played a leading role in the CEO succession and transition at a variety of firms. His key area of expertise is in designing and implementing initiatives for senior leaders to drive executive team effectiveness and internal development needs. Now I'd like to invite our panelists to share their opening remarks, starting with Taimur.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I will start by setting a bit of a context because where we're going is hugely dependent on where we're coming from. And we need to keep in mind that the global economy was not at its sound best coming into this crisis. So ending 2019, starting 2020, we were living in a world characterized by fairly low growth momentum. So the 2019 growth in the US, European Union, China were all lower than 2018 growth. And then 2020 post the phase one trade deal between the US and China, maybe there was some hope. But at the same time, it was not just about that. There was also a malaise in global electronics cycle, which was hampering investment back. So we weren't exactly in the strongest health. Secondly, in addition to slowing growth momentum, we came into this crisis with exceptionally high valuation in asset markets. So when you look at, say, Case-Shiller PE or sovereign spreads or what was happening in the credit area, everywhere assets were very expensive. So they had a lot to fall in any case. On top of that, we came into this crisis with a lot of debt. 10, 12 years ago, China had a debt to GDP ratio, consolidated basis about 150. It's about 250 today. Malaysia had something in the range of 150. It's about 190 today. South Korea, 10 to 12 years ago, 160, close to 200% of debt to GDP ratio today. So slowing growth, rich asset valuation, high debt, and on top of all this, independent of the arrival of Donald Trump, there has been this steady rise in protectionism for the last decade or so. So global trade took a big downshift after the global financial crisis. And since then, big nations have been putting up barriers against each other, which have, of course, accelerated thanks to the US-China trade war, but it was a reality even before that. So we came into this with all this, and then we get this shock, and this shock has hurt the emerging markets actually even more than the headline-grabbing numbers and narratives that we see in the developed markets. In fact, for most emerging markets, the financial contagion from the COVID-19 crisis was the first crisis. Even before they started reporting pandemic-related issues and statistics, countries like Argentina, Brazil, India, Indonesia, all got slammed by historically large capital outflow. In fact, the trends are so dire that we probably will see the worst year for emerging market capital flows we have ever seen. We may see as low as maybe about $350 billion in investment, whether it's portfolio or foreign direct into emerging markets this year. Compare that to about $1 trillion that we've seen in recent years. So $400 or $500 billion shortfall in emerging market financing this year because of the unrest in the market and the flight of capital going back to the developed markets. The final point that I want to make before passing the baton to Bert is that this notion of this dual contagion, Yale University's Robert Shiller has been talking about this a lot, that on one hand you have a pandemic, there's a lot of uncertainty and concerns about that, and there's a lot of policy to deal with that. But then you have a pandemic-induced economic anxiety and contagion around that. Do I really want to keep my money in emerging markets where I'm not entirely sure whether they have the wherewithal to deal with this crisis and maybe my investment will be at risk? So I'm going to take my money out. But that act of taking the money out itself creates a crisis for emerging markets independent of the pandemic. So that's the world we're living in. We have a dual contagion in a world where we were not particularly healthy coming in, and now we are dealing with literally a health crisis, which is going to worsen our fiscal, financial, economic health considerably, regardless of how quickly or how slowly we come out of this.
Thank you very much, Tamer. Bert, over to you.
All right, let me add some bad news to Tamer's introduction. Look, this is a very, very big shock to the world economy. Before COVID-19, the projections were more or less to 3 to 3.5% growth for the world economy. Now, the IMF's projection is minus 3% for the world economy in almost the good case, if you want to have some more downside scenarios. So that's a difference of 6 percentage point of growth. 6 percentage point of the world economy, it's a $6 trillion shock, a $6 trillion shock to the world economy. And comparative to the global financial crisis, which was bad, and it was a recession, but the decline of world GDP was only 1.5%. So this is, if you want, double the decline of world GDP compared to the global financial crisis. So that's a really big shock to the economy. There's a couple of good things that I want to point out. One is, yes, it is a big shock, but gradually there is quite a bit of clarity on what to do with the health side. And it will take a while. One needs to work through it. The measures are difficult, but there is, if you want, light at the end of the tunnel. The final light will be a vaccine that will be a while away, maybe a year and a half, but already the measures to be taken to work through a reasonable economy until that is available are pretty much clear. And some countries have shown it. There's some real stars like Taiwan. There's in Europe, you see Germany having a pretty good record, and one can learn from that. The second is that the policy response to this crisis has been very big. Maybe not as coordinated as we wanted, maybe not as tilted towards emerging economies, but within 2 weeks after the WHO declared a global pandemic, there was a G20 meeting where the G20, the 20 largest economies in the world, pledged basically $5 trillion or 10% of their GDP in terms of measures to be taken. If you look at what is happening around the world, you see the fiscal deficits to be very, very large in response to this global financial crisis. To go basically from something below 4% last year to 10% this year. And that money is being used, well, first, to get the health systems prepared for the pandemic. Second, to keep companies alive during the pandemic and during the measures to fight it, and to keep jobs alive during that time. And third, and that's what you see in some countries now starting to happen, and that is to revamp the economy after the pandemic is under control. So a very strong policy reaction compared to what happened during the global financial crisis. It took 6 months before the G20 got together in London, and that basically became the turning point at that point. Here, the policy reaction has been faster and, in my view, more targeted towards the problem. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Bert. Over to you, Gareth.
Okay, well, it's obviously it's a lot of rightly so doom and gloom. I mean, this is unprecedented times. But if I think about the lead up to this, I mean, honestly, from the business perspective and the challenge facing the leaders in our businesses, I mean, for many years, people have been talking about the speed of disruption and how much it was increasing. I mean, honestly, all companies have been faced historically, have been faced with the dilemma of how to perform, drive the current business, and transform at the same time. And honestly, most people have been failing with that dilemma. The short-term performance has always tended to trump the transformation. I mean, digital transformation, which we'll talk about, has often been spoken about, but very different interpretations of it. And if I think, I mean, my own business, Kuan, we have placed lots of transformation officers, digital officers, chief culture officers, and there's been a lot of activity, but not really a lot of effectiveness in this. And then in comes COVID-19, which has and is, honestly, it's doing more to drive transformation than all of the roles that have been created in the recent past to do just that. Transformation has now become much more than a theoretical idea. Are a nice to have when we're less busy. Honestly, right now, given the economic picture that's been just painted, organizations, transformation is now a necessity. They have got to change the way that they do business. And post COVID-19, or post this wave of COVID-19, and I'm sure we'll speak a little bit about that, there will be, whether we like it or not, there will be a new way of doing business moving forward, or a relatively new way, certainly compared to the start of January the 1st of 2020. And And again, in all the doom and gloom, when we talk to our different clients around the world in different industries, I mean, it's not, there are some silver linings, or some industries are seeing as some opportunities for them. There is some positive impact being forced because of the virus, which I'm sure we'll speak about. But if I look at from a resilience perspective, what is going to be required, and this will come down to leadership, either leadership at the government and the country level, to leadership within organizations, at the top of organizations, and even right down to the managers. It is going to require a different type of leadership across all of the industries and all of the organizations we've looked at. There are certain emerging themes that are seen as critical for our success, to have us not only get through this crisis, but also be prepared to pull out of it as quickly as possible. Obviously, cost savings. I mean, a lot of work has been done and is being done around cost savings, but it's not just a case of where and how do we save costs. How do we then structure ourselves as a result of the cost savings? How do we remunerate our people so that they're incentivized and excited about finding solutions and staying relevant as we move forward? Also then, I mean, a lot of focus from a logistics perspective, supply chain, the disruption to supply chain. Companies are having to rethink about where stuff gets manufactured. Should they put all their eggs in one basket with China, India, whatever? So all of these conversations are critical right now for organizations. But on the softer side, one of the most consistent themes we're seeing as we talk to our clients about what they think will be required, a real grapple around employee engagement. And ultimately that is a leadership challenge. And we'll talk a little bit about what works and what doesn't. But employee engagement, having employees engaged and empowered to, I guess, to stay relevant, becomes critical. And then we get on to the future of work. I mean, processes are going to be more automated as a result of what we're going through. And we're all learning much more about virtual collaboration. And there will be some new business opportunities, be it from virtual change in virtual presence and the like. But really, we see it as, I mean, the challenges facing leadership. And in leadership, I mean, I'm referring to a very broad leadership in a broad sense. There are lots of leaders within organizations, from the board to the CEO, down through the C-suite, and frankly, down to the line managers. Leadership is going to be critical in this. And I'm sure as we get into the next hour, we'll talk a little bit more about what's working, what isn't working, and what type of leadership will be required.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Now, before we go to the many questions that all of you have submitted, and thank you for doing that in advance and here at the Q&A that you see at the bottom of your screen, I wanted to mention a book that's helped me a lot through this time in reframing what's going on and being able to assess the information in a more realistic way, which is Hans Rosling's Factfulness. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. Hans Rosling, Factfulness. And in it, he says, things can be both bad and better. So since we've been talking a lot about the bad, I wanted to open up first with something where I would like the panelists to tell us what has actually been getting better despite the bad. Maybe I could start with Tamer.
Well, look, the SME world, which is facing a lot of pressure, at the same time has turned out to be quite intrepid. Whether you look at Chinese SMEs, which have converted themselves from producing sneakers and shirts to PPEs and exporting all over the world, or to machine tool companies, which are now coming up with ways to expedite the manufacturing of ventilators, it tells you that technology and entrepreneurism put together gives you a bit of a head start these days in dealing with the crisis than it did in the past. Now, the other issue is the question of new technology to create stuff at home when the supply chain gets disrupted. Just this morning, I read this wonderful news about how in Gaza Strip, of all the places in the world, they're using 3D printing to come up with face shields and shape them, which is being marketed exclusive to Israel. Now, imagine the multiple layers of irony in that whole process, but the fact of the matter is that allows a source of livelihood to a strip that is completely devoid of economic opportunities in any case, but also exacerbated because of the lockdown. But there you go, 3D printing saving the day for at least some people. So I think that sort of intersection of newer technological capabilities and entrepreneurialism is a silver lining. We have put it to test, and in some ways it's coming out pretty well. It doesn't necessarily resolve the bigger questions around supply chains around the world, which are still deeply disrupted. But at some level, it's a hopeful picture.
Thank you, Tamer. So what's getting better, Bert? What do you think?
Well, I'd like to emphasize 2 points. One is actually the learning around the impact of COVID-19 and the policy measures that can be taken to control the epidemic. And I think there's enormous amount of learning that has been going on. So very quickly we're starting to converge, maybe not all countries, but we're starting to converge to sort of a thing to do. And in the economist world, there's the hammer and the dance. So you need to hammer down the epidemic to a manageable level, and then you dance around a little bit in order to until you have a vaccine. Second, what I think is hopeful is, I mean, it's a feature of COVID-19 that apparently does impact much more the elderly compared to the young. And that is a huge benefit for developing countries, especially the low-income developing countries, who are far younger than the average age of the advanced countries. I mean, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the average age is 19 compared to 42 in the OECD countries. So the impact in those countries will be most likely be far less than in advanced countries, which is good because their health system are far weaker. Their economic opportunities to bear the cost of isolation is far less. So but I see that as a positive news. There is some light for them at the end of that tunnel as well.
Thank you. What do you think, Gareth? What's been getting better? You alluded to it a bit in your opening remarks.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. I'll share one in terms of profession and then one personally, which I'm finding interesting as well. But if I think about, I mean, I mentioned about the leadership, the importance of leadership at this point. And one of the things that I've noticed that's really is getting better is around leadership and their understanding of employees. And what I mean by that is, I mean, everyone's identifying that employee engagement and enablement is going to be critical to help us pull through this and move forward. Historically, in a way, employee engagement was kind of something that was measured on an HR survey, but it didn't actually necessarily directly translate to something tangible for the CEO and for the leaders. Now it's much closer to home. I mean, leaders are now actually recognizing the practical importance of having employees engaged, staying in regular communication with them, keeping them motivated, because honestly, they have to at this point. Because of the uncertainty in the markets, because of the uncertainty with the business, it's really critical that employees stay as relevant as possible. And leaders cannot help create that if they're not keeping people engaged in a certain way. So one of the benefits, if you call it a benefit, that I find is it's moved from a concept or a theory of, oh yeah, of course it's important, to actually leaders are waking up in the morning going, okay, what am I doing today to engage my employees, to keep people focused, to keep them engaged, to keep them being creative about new business. So that's one. And again, then the second thing for me, and this is more on a personal thing, I'm not sure what it's like for everyone else, but this has been a fascinating case study for me, this last 3 or 4 weeks being locked up at home. My relationship with my family and my kids, my wife for years has been saying we have to have dinner together, we need to be turn the television off, have some real conversations. It's because of the environment we're currently in. I have been amazed at what's been happening for me with the family. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I've heard from other people in different organizations. And that's I guess it doesn't speak into what we're talking about in the webinar, but it does to a certain extent, because it is about in a different type of engagement with the people around us. So that's a sort of on a personal thing. I'm not sure my kids are enjoying it as much as I am, but it's kind of, it goes with the territory.
Thank you, Gareth. Tamer, I'm going to come back to you with a question about ASEAN markets. We received some questions asking how the impact differs between the markets and also what's the outlook on consumer demand. And one of the questions was very specific as well, the investment that probably is being redirected to developing economies, specifically the redirection of investments from China or versus China. So basically, what's the situation in ASEAN in relation to each other and to the rest of the countries in the world?
Right, so the last part of the question I'll leave for Bert to answer in terms of Chinese investment going toward ASEAN or not. But generally speaking, it's a heterogeneous bunch of countries. You've got rich countries like Singapore, you've got developing countries like Indonesia, somewhere in between like Malaysia, and very low end of the developing spectrum like Cambodia, Laos. So we can't give you a set sort of answer for that whole question for ASEAN, but let's put it this way. With respect to what's happening in terms of global demand destruction and sharp traction in the commodity space, Malaysia is the most vulnerable economy right now in Southeast Asia. They are reliant on electronics exports, probably not going to do well for a while. 20% of their fiscal revenues come from oil and gas related exports. That's going to contract substantially. And among all the ASEAN countries, they actually have announced the most ambitious, far-reaching fiscal support program to protect their economy from the COVID-19 related lockdown. So their affordability is going down exactly at the time when they have opened their purses like no tomorrow. So I worry a bit about Malaysia macro, micro risk in general. For the rest of ASEAN, there are some countries which are doing heroic things. So if you sort of try to rank the stringency measures of lockdown, Singapore was somewhat low in February, early March, and now it's very high. And Singapore also has a very large package to support its population. So both stringent to put the disease to rest, as well as lots of money being spent to deal with the economic fallout. It's hard for most countries of the world to sort of reach that nexus where you do very tough measures and spend a lot of money. So take countries like, say, India, Indonesia, Vietnam. They are pretty high on the stringency index. They have shut their countries down. People are staying at home, but there's a lot of economic distress, but their packages are not even a fraction of the package that a country like Singapore or Malaysia can offer. So that trade-off between lives and livelihood, it's easier to deal with that when you have a lot of money in a deep pocket, like a Singapore or Korea or Taiwan, whereas if you don't have a deep pocket, then you may have to still deal with very highly stringent policy measures, but it's very difficult to offset the economic distress because you just don't have deep enough pockets. So that's the broad snapshot, if you will, of what's happening in ASEAN, but that's just the economic and the health side. I'm just going to go back to my earlier point about the financial market side, that the region has benefited tremendously over the last 2 decades or so from global portfolio managers, inflows, and of course, global foreign direct investment. I'm not particularly pessimistic about the FDI outlook, but for the rest of the year, it's hard for me to see how foreign portfolio flows come back to Asia in a meaningful manner. That would put pressure on countries that don't have very large buffers to deal with external payments. And with that, I basically have 3 countries in mind: India, Indonesia, and Malaysia. So if dollar funding is an issue for the rest of the year, those 3 countries in Asia will face quite a bit of pressure.
As far as the China aspect goes, look, the big question is still, what will China plan for its own recovery? And up until now, the fiscal moves in China have been very modest compared to the global financial crisis. I expect quite a bit more to come, which will be largely focused to domestic investment, if you want. It does have an implication, aside from the factors, the uncertainty factors that Timur mentioned. It will also mean that China will simply have less financing for overseas investment. And therefore, if you want the big initiatives such as Belt and Road Initiative, they'll slow down. They won't disappear, but they'll slow down for this year and probably next, simply because the emphasis is on domestic recovery rather than international. Thanks.
There's been some conversation about the sharing economy that's now going to become the isolation economy. And in my mind, it also leads to this idea of globalization versus isolation, right? So what are your thoughts about the sharing economy? And I'm going to direct this at Gareth for a slightly different twist on this, because a sharing economy also means that we have gig workers, people who are on contract, people who are leasing out their homes on short-term basis. How do businesses cope with switching from a sharing economy to an isolation economy, or do you think that's not going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting because I've had two very different conversations about this last Friday. If we're talking about resilience and what's going to work, competition competition has historically been important. Collaboration between organizations right now is becoming even more important. And that would go from the isolationist view in an organization to actually collaborating across organizations. One, to find, from a healthcare perspective, to find cures. But secondly, organizations are now putting their heads together around, okay, what are our innovative approach to moving forward? How do we work together to collectively figure out what is the best way forward for our industry and for our organization? So I actually think that, I do not think that organizations can afford to become isolationist and focus too much purely on themselves. There's a natural phenomenon when we start in this, which is, okay, internal focus. What do I need to do to cut costs, to make myself as lean and mean as possible? But then the focus very quickly needs to shift to, okay, what is needed for our clients? And collectively with our historic competitors, what do we need to do? How do we need to look at our business in a different way together so that we can serve our clients? So I don't actually think that the isolationist approach will work for organizations. But again, I'm not in terms of the overall expertness, I mean, I would leave it to my two learned colleagues in this. I'm sure you've got a different view, or maybe not. I mean, what do we think is required?
Bert, what do you think? I mean, from a developing economy's point of view, are they able to afford to be isolationist? And what would that even mean anyway? Bert, I think you're on mute.
Bert, you're on mute.
I'm going to unmute you.
I'm sorry.
Oh, there you go.
So look, I no, they're not, and it would be foolish if they were to go in that direction. I think you will see some rebalancing in globalization and some reconsideration about this issue of resilience. And individual companies will do that, and countries will do that, and they will look at their essentials. And yes, I'm sure most countries will end up with a little cottage industry and mass production at some point. But for the bigger picture, it's highly unlikely that is going to happen. Frankly, I think the tensions between the US and China are more important a factor in that than the COVID-19, simply because you can't hide. I mean, just because there was one country that fell out of the supply chain for 3 months, which was China, happened to be the most important node in the global value chains. It doesn't mean that if you move it to another country that you'd be safe. So I think there will be some adjustment, but largely focused on the essentials. And for developing countries, it's even more case to be part of this global supply chain, because that's going to help them get out of the economic downturn because of COVID-19.
Thank you. On a related question, Taimur, with globalization and versus isolationism, I mean, we see some of the biggest economies in the world starting to be very insular. We see it in Europe. We've been seeing it with the US, some of the rhetoric. Can you have recovery without the big economies?
Well, it's hard to have any sort of turnaround in global fortune without the demand coming from the big countries of the world. So if you don't have US and China recover in a meaningful manner, and your economy depends on exports, I mean, how are you going to grow? So that issue is a big one, and therefore we should all hope and pray that the early signs of going back to work that we have seen in China at least allows some degree of domestic demand pickup in China and leads to some degree of pickup in Chinese demand for things that China imports for its own self. And then hopefully that acts as a catalyst to get the whole world going, and the heroic fiscal and monetary stimulus measures that are in place in Europe and the US leads to some degree of recovery in domestic demand after what will be a very, very bad second quarter. Just to add on to Bert and Garrett's point on isolationism versus sticking to globalization, I think that the warehouse industry is going to see a huge pickup, because the lesson for corporate CEOs and for nations is that if you have some stockpile of a few essential things, it's always prudent. Take, for example, India. people always make fun of India for having this famine mentality, and they buy millions and millions of tons of rice grain and lentils and pulses and flour and stuff every year. And a lot of the stuff goes bad after a few years because they don't disperse it. But now there are many countries in the world that may face food insecurity. At least as far as cereals and grains are concerned, India is not going to worry about that because all those years of inefficient stock building is going to pay off this time. So this is what Nassim Taleb talks about in his book, Black Swan, that, you know, if you want to be anti-fragile, you have to embrace some degree of inefficiency. The world that we lived in and got used to it, you know, just-in-time inventory management, very, very lean inventory processes, that gets flushed out in shocks like this. So on a day-to-day basis, it does look like a bit of a wasteful activity, but then when you get a very big shock, that wasteful activity pays off pretty well, even if it takes 10, 15 years to pay off.
Actually, just one thing to add on, Tim, because I mean, when you mention warehouses in the job industry, one of I'm not going to say a bright spot, but as a result of all this logistics, there are going to be this will be one area that's looking to hire a different type of talent, because supply chains are going to be under the microscope, whether we like it or not now, for the foreseeable future, and organizations are going to need professionals to redesign and remodel their supply chains. Retailers will need executives to create and manage supply chains, so you can move product from factories to warehouses to consumers. So there will be significant change in this area. So in all the doom and gloom, I mean, there are a couple of areas where there will be some job opportunities for people, which is strange when you think about the overall market and how challenged we are.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. Tim, I'm going to come back to you because there are some fundamental economics questions that I think need to be answered. Ray Dalio has been on the news and on his LinkedIn talking about printing money and all that kind of stuff. It's a little complicated for a simple epidemiologist. So I'm going to ask you what he's been talking about, because one of the questions that came through was governments are pumping trillions into the economy on top of high debt to GDP ratios. Where's this money coming from? Is it printing more, like Ray says?
Well, Ray Dalio's perspective is not particularly international. When he says trillions of dollars being printed, he's basically alluding to the US and maybe to some tangential extent, Europe, not necessarily the rest of the world. So that's the first thing we need to recognize. Things that the US Federal Reserve can do, or to some extent the ECB can do, or the BOJ, most of us can't do. We don't have reserve currencies. So everybody has a printing press, but not everybody can print unlimited amounts of money with very little consequence in the short term. The US has that unique position. Everybody wants to hold the dollar. Global trade is largely invoiced in US dollars. And whenever there's a panic, we go to the US markets because it's liquid. And hence, the Americans can go ahead and print a lot of dollars. And for the time being, that doesn't lead to US sovereign outlook being downgraded, or US dollar depreciating substantially, or US interest rates going up a lot. And I think that can go on for a while. And let's also, I want to share with you one sort of a boring economic artifact, but it's an important one to keep in mind, which is the rate of interest in most economies in the world under normal circumstances should be a function of the rate of return on capital. So if you're looking at an economy which is condemned to fairly low growth for a long, long time, there won't be much high interest rates in that economy to begin with, because unless they're mismanaging the economy, is because the rate of return is low. So if the US and Europe and Japan are heading toward a world where they're aging, they have a lot of savings to do, their rates will remain depressed. And therefore, this notion that they can sort of get away with the printing, there are other reasons for that. It's not just that there's this magical ability for the Fed to generate money out of thin air. But when we are talking about our neck of the woods, that's simply not possible. I told you earlier that countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, India have fairly small fiscal stimulus injected so far in this crisis. The reason is they can't just get away by printing lots and lots of money. It's only for the chosen few.
Thank you very much, Tamer. Bert, what are your thoughts on this printing money in other parts of the world? Possible?
Yes, possible. I mean, if you, I'm with Tamer there, maybe we went to the same schools, but look, if you are at an almost zero interest rate, then whether you have money or issue bonds as a government, it doesn't really matter that much. It's almost the same. If you look at what does it cost the government to run overall in the world a 10% of GDP deficit? It actually costs you less than 2 years ago running a 4% deficit in terms of interest paid. So if not now, when? This is a good time for a government to really push demand. And in part, that's because picking up the demand of companies that have lowered their investment and households that have lowered their consumption. So it is just basically taking up the slack, and it's the right thing to do. Granted, some countries have more luxury than others, and emerging economies, not least because they were hit by an outflow of money, have a harder time, but they don't have, it's not impossible for them. Their domestic capital markets are now more sophisticated than they were in the past, especially since the Asia financial crisis, but even since the global financial crisis. So I'm maybe a tad more optimistic than Timor on that, but I don't have any real money at stake, and Timor has DBS money at stake.
I'm going to pull us back to,
two small points to Bert's. So when he talked about that, how interest payment is less. So let's take the US, for example. The total interest payment of US Treasury 10 years ago as a share of GDP is actually bigger than what it is now, despite significantly higher debt. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Second is that both Bert and I have a very near and dear country right next to south of Singapore, which is Indonesia. Indonesia is a case in point. I mentioned earlier that a country like Indonesia has very small buffers and doesn't have the wherewithal to spend a lot of money to support themselves. But at the same time, in the last couple of weeks, Indonesia has managed to issue a sovereign bond, which has gotten very good reception from global investors. Indonesia has managed to seek bilateral and get bilateral swap lines from MAS, from the BIS. It has access to the Federal Reserve's newly established window. So it doesn't have to be as bad as it was in the past. Not only are domestic financial markets a little more sophisticated, we have had some gains over the last decade or two in terms of creating some lifeline for emerging market economies. That'll come in handy now.
Thank you, Timor. Gareth, I'm going to come back to you and pull us back to Singapore. Between now and the end of circuit breaker at the beginning of June, what do you think leaders should be doing to prepare their workforce, all the way from the mundane, talking about office design, preserving physical distancing, to something more, intangible in a way, but you spoke about employee engagement. How do we prepare ourselves in the next few weeks to get back to our office?
Yeah, and again, I'm fingers crossed that it is the 1st of June, because I'm honestly, that's one of the challenges that leaders are facing. Will it be before? Will it be after? I was asked this on an internal town hall call on Friday. When do we thought we'd be back to normal? And when would our business projections change? And honestly, it's a virtually impossible question to answer. But in terms of how do businesses prepare, this for me is the softer side of where leadership becomes important. The way leaders are with their people over the next 4 weeks, 6 weeks and beyond. You have to, someone sent a question and asked me about what did I mean by employee engagement? Are you referring to surveys? I'm really not. That's not about how you measure employee engagement. It's, are your employees right now, are they engaged in a way where they're finding ways to be relevant? Okay. They're actually proactively looking at, as they're doing the job, am I making a difference? Am I being impactful or not? And that does come down to the way the senior leader communicates. Are the leaders communicating regularly as we go through the remainder of the circuit breaker? People are going through a real emotional cycle here, and the anxiety is it's up to the leader to put their arms around them and help their employees with this. Keep the communication simple. But also, and this is, I don't want to get into a conversation about various leaders globally and how they're communicating, but you have to be honest, okay? As we go through this, the fact you're willing to say, I don't know when this is going to end, if that's an honest answer for you, that's okay, but you have to be honest with people. You can be honest and be kind and communicate with empathy. You also have to tell people the difficulties that your business is challenging, or that your business is facing, and assure them that you're doing your best, okay? The critical thing for me is to get out of this, when the circuit breaker finishes, you want employees coming back ready to roll up their sleeves and go, okay, how do we move this forward? How do we find our opportunities? How do we get back on the trajectory that we were on 3 months, 6 months ago? So this is all about working with people around their attitude, and the leader's approach to this becomes absolutely critical. So it's not about measuring engagement. You'll measure engagement by how effective the individuals are at jumping in to help and create the future for the organization. So that's the bit that I would say. There's an awful lot of work that can be done while we're, I don't want to say waiting for the circuit breaker to finish, because we're not really waiting for it. We're redesigning the businesses as we go at this point. But you cannot do it alone. You have to do it with your employees and give them a voice. Having feedback loops, asking employees what they think is needed will also greatly help as we go through this next 4 and 5 weeks.
Thank you, Gareth. I'm going to stay on the topic of employees because we know that many employees are struggling. We see the unemployment rate around the world just skyrocketing. In Singapore, although the government has been very clear that we want to minimize retrenchment, it's still happening, and there are still measures in place to help people find other jobs. But, you know, what are the strategies to help those who are newly unemployed, those who have been unemployed, underserved, the poor? You know, this whole time, they're going to struggle even more with COVID-19. I'm going to turn to Bert. What are your thoughts around, you know, the funding for charities, for NGOs? How is that going to change in this situation? And how do we help those who are not able to help themselves right now?
I'm very sorry. You probably have a lot of background noise, and maybe it's
okay.
Yes. Okay. Good.
Yes.
Look. This is going to be a huge challenge, of course, and the government can't do everything. I mean, a lot the government has to do. A lot the government has to finance, but to actually operationalize some of these support will have to be through NGOs, will have to be through communities, and I think a fair amount of that is happening around the region, at least the countries that I look at, not just Singapore, but Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines. A lot of community work is going on to reach the more vulnerable. In terms of the labor market, it's a real challenge because you do see now in the more advanced countries a lot of students graduating from university in a market that is just going to be terrible for the next couple of months. So what to do, how to address that. And I think in part businesses will still see, the larger businesses will still see their opportunities and they will have their normal hiring stream. In case of the government, they can lean forward, and there's been in Singapore, there's been a good scheme that my institute is also going to make use of, that they actually subsidize taking on new workers in this difficult market, and I think that's a tremendously good initiative, in order not to lose that human capital or to derail that human capital. So it means that for the next couple of months, we basically, well, it's not for free, but for almost free, you can get people on the books, and that will help us, and it will help the people involved. So there's a lot that the government can do, but that communities can do, that individual businesses can do to alleviate a possible dire situation.
Thank you, Bert.
On that point, so from a business cycle perspective, the big lesson over the last 15 years or so has been that countries that tried to stop employees from firing people a lot in the 08-09 crisis found it a little easier to come out of it. So not that, this is a conventional wisdom and all policymakers are following it. In the US, it seems to me the Paycheck Protection Program is only a subset of the overall government dynamic, which is actually allow people to file for unemployment, but will give them extension of their unemployment benefit and so on. Whereas in Singapore and Europe, the view is a bit different, which is the business cycle is so asymmetric. Companies fire lots of people, but they take forever to hire those people back. So if there is a way, if you believe that the crisis is temporary, if there's a way to prevent that from happening, it will be very good for the business cycle from a long-term stability perspective. So which is why I think the Europeans have also taken a page out of the likes of Singapore from past experience, that to give businesses incentives not to go out on a big scale firing immediately is probably good for the society.
Thank you, Timur. I'm going to stay on you because while we talk about governments a lot, and we know that many governments, including Singapore, have been doing all they can to provide funding for businesses, we do have one comment from our audience that talks about the timing of funding and that it might not be distributed in a way that is useful to them right in the crux. And also, so related to that is, what are banks doing to help to supplement government funding? And then related to that, are banks going to go bankrupt? That is seriously a question that was asked. I didn't make it up.
I've been so instead of, at the risk of turning this into a commercial for DBS, I'll just say that, you know, by and large, all over the world, the banks are not a part of the problem in this crisis. As Augustine Carstens, who's the head of Bank for International Settlement, said, they need to be part of the solution this round. They have built up stronger capital buffers than what they had in 08, 09. They now need to sort of deploy that capital. So I'm not going to get into the discussion of whether, you know, banks and corporations should suspend dividends and stuff. That's, you know, sort of beyond my pay grade. But by and large, I think that central banks around the world are using the financial sector very proactively, both the bank and non-bank financial system, to target the needy and channel the credit and support to them through the financial sector. And it's working out pretty well, not just in the rich countries of the world, even in developing countries over the last 5 to 7 years, as fintech has broadened and deepened, the way to reach people has become a bit easier. And we're beginning to see that play out in countries that have large support programs for households that can be now used very quickly to disburse money to the very needy. And you see that even in countries like India, where capacity constraint is always a question, but you see that also in Brazil and Colombia, elsewhere. So I think that there's always a struggle because how dramatic this whole crisis has been. You know, 2 months ago, we were kind of chilled out about it, and now it's like the mother of all crises. So one needs to have some sympathy for the governments also, that if they have not been super successful in finding the last mile disbursement for every single needy person, there will be people who will fall through the cracks, even in an advanced country like Singapore or a developing country like India. But I cannot come up with a country out there right now among the ones that I focus where there's willful neglect. Everybody is really hunkering down and trying to reach the needy. And mind you, it's not only about the government. And again, you see this in the Indonesias and Philippines of the world, as well as in India and Brazil. The mobilization at the grassroots level from the non-government organizations, from philanthropic organizations has been absolutely fantastic. Even here in Singapore, I know myself and my friends and others, my relatives, how, you know, people are, you know, really extending their wallet to help the dorm workers who are affected and who are actually facing massive uncertainty with their livelihood. So in a way, the crisis is bringing government, civil society, and people together. And I think we are coming across as pretty proactive. I wouldn't give up on us yet.
Thank you so much, Taimur. Gareth, I'm going to come back to you and talk a little bit more about preparing employees for returning to work, to roll up their sleeves. You said in your opening comments the importance of recognizing that activity isn't exactly effectiveness. And I learned a term last week called actionism, which is really generating a lot of activity without having a really impactful outcome. So when it comes to actionism, is that, how do we address that during this time when we're in circuit breaker and the impact of it on the psychological health of our employees? Because that mental health perspective has been coming up more and more, and we've had a couple of questions about how do we make sure that our employees' psychological health is taken care of. Does it mean that we should be giving them a bit more time off during the week?
You need to be careful what I say here in case anyone from my friends actually, it's interesting what you say in terms of the mental health piece, because that's also one of the things that has come out of this. A lot of organizations, a lot of the larger organizations have mechanisms in place, people that you can go to, people that you can talk to, people who are there to support. And historically, those mechanisms have not been used. Okay, but now as we get through the crisis, people are actually realizing, wait a minute, there is these people who are dedicated to helping our employees, and that's actually becoming more and more relevant with organizations. I mean, what I would say in terms of the effect of getting ready to return to work, I do think returning to work, I mean, that implies at the minute that we're not at work, because there is an element there of we are trying to manage businesses as best we can. But there is a huge difference between working from home and working from home effectively. And that's honestly, that's one of the things that I think this last month and this next month will really help us to establish. I do think moving forward, the future of work, there is going to be much more of an element of virtual collaboration, working virtually. And I think how organizations can help their employees prepare for that is by doing check-ins about what's been working, what hasn't been working over the last 4 weeks. I do think that with the working from home, with the phenomenon associated with it, managers, leaders, they do need to provide more flexibility for their teams. I actually think it'd be interesting to do a study at the end of this, but I actually think that for some people, their productivity will actually have gone up over this period because of the freedom that they have to do some work now, to step away for an hour because there's something else that they have to do and then re-engage. I think the work hours have changed completely, and that doesn't mean they have reduced. I think there's just a lot more flexibility in it. So I think in terms of preparing people for life after the circuit breaker, I do think organizations need to identify the structures that they need to have to enable people to continue working from home at times. Obviously, there will be an element of wanting people back in sort of the physical workspace. But I also think it's interesting. I also think one thing that will change here will be around real estate. I mean, the commercial real estate market is, I think it's last year, I think it was $800 billion. Honestly, the CEO of Morgan Stanley has just said he doesn't need a footprint to run his organization. And I think we are going to see more and more of that, where we shift the costs from expensive real estate, big cities, people can work much more remotely. And I think that will be accelerated. I do not think we will ever be back to the way it was 1st of January. So that's, it is, and this is changing on a week by week basis. We're learning more and more about what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah. So in our last few minutes, I'd like to ask our panelists to leave a thought for our audience on how to stay resilient, how to survive this. Maybe I'll stay with you, Gareth, since you've already started on that track about sharing. How do we hang in there? I've just left a comment for one of our audience saying, hang in there, because I can start to feel this continuing sense of anxiety about how do we prepare, even though we know there are some good things happening out there. What do you want to leave our audience with, Gareth?
I would say, if the audience would think, as you think about your job, whatever the job may be, rather than find out this is my job, this is what I do, shifting the conversation. Okay, given my job, what is needed? What is the most impactful thing that I can do today? And on the times when you look at your schedule and go, okay, I've got a gap here, don't see it as a gap. See it as an opportunity to reach out to someone either internal in your organization or a client, because that type of engagement, not necessarily about something specific to your job, but just that type of engagement and collaboration, it creates engagement, creates more engagement, which prepares us for the future. So that will help people to hang in there by staying connected.
Thank you, Gareth. Bert, what do you want to leave our audience with?
Well, I think businesses, but also investors should understand that a solution is basically there, but that the path towards that solution may not be smooth, and that there will be ups and downs, and there will be some setbacks along the way, and that even if you reopen the economy, there might be additional measures coming down the line that might restrict it a little bit. So it won't be one day we'll wake up and we're back to normal. It will be a path for the next basically year, maybe even longer, to go through. In that context, also in terms of investment, I think to some extent the markets, or the time we should talk about it, but they're already there saying, oh, we've solved the issue and we got enough support from the government and the liquidity is there. I think there might be some setbacks on the markets as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Bert. Taimur?
All right, just for the edification of everybody who has sent in questions, that between the three of us, we have already answered 14 of them. We have typed it while others were speaking, just to let everybody know. Look, a global pandemic like this and a global financial crisis like this requires globally coordinated solutions. I've seen this tone through the questions today that a lot of people think that, we're heading into this world of isolationism and redundancy. Well, not quite. I think that the real solution is actually to recognize that the interconnectedness that we have in this world, whether it's for a virus or for trade, we just can't avoid it. Mind you, even when there was no global jet-setting travel going on in the 14th century and the early 20th century, pandemics spread worldwide. So you can't really keep a border up to prevent viruses from coming to your country. So cooperation and coordination at a global level, whether it is World Health Organization or the multilateral financial institutions that are out there, is imperative. And I think crises like this sort of galvanize the need for that we are all living in this world where borders are artificial and arbitrary. The viruses don't know that. And to deal with them, we all have to hold each other's hands and deal with it as a collective. Short of that, till even a single country is left winning this battle, nobody will have won the battle comprehensively.
Thank you so much, panelists. Gareth, Bert, Taimur, it's wonderful to have this hour with you. And thank you to all our audience for submitting your questions. The fourth and final webinar of this series will be on Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Singapore time. And the moderator is one much better than me. It'll be Christy Lou Stout from CNN, anchor and reporter, along with international global health experts. So hope you will join us then. You can sign up via our LinkedIn page. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, all the panelists. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.